think most people, when they encounter bundle grading, come at it through what we call specifications grading or spec grading. That is, and also I think contract grading often includes bundling. And so you have a series of assignment types, you set very specific guidelines for what a successful completion of that assignment type would look like. And then students have the opportunity to pick different assignments within each groups. And then they have to meet that specification in order to sort of check that box and move on. I've adapted it into a system that does not rely on specs grading. So aside from discussion post, which I haven't done as much on Canvas post ChatGPT release. So that was probably the only version of specs grading where as long as they hit roughly the intended word amount, as long as they engaged thoughtfully with the topic, and as long as they interacted with at least two other posts, that was a sort of check, they've done it, great, full marks. I have moved away from discussion posts, but still incorporate bundled grading, though without that kind of specification approach. So in my classes, what that means is that I have a couple of different assignment types. Given it's a history class, or my classes are within history, there are a number of what we call like critical kind of reading assignments, so primary or secondary text analyses that ask them to think really thoughtfully about the material and engage with it critically. Those are kind of really traditional historical writing assignments. So there's always a sort of chunk of those that make up their grades. I always try and incorporate creative assignments because, again, when you think about sort of our taxonomies of learning, and I think Bloom is the one that most people are familiar with, the ability to create with information is one of the sort of best ways of solidifying knowledge construction. So I always include creative assignments. And then depending on the class, there might be other types of assignments built in. And so with the bundle approach, I'll have these different sort of classes or categories of assignments. There's always choice. So I'll assign, say, 6 reading responses, and students are responsible for completing a couple of those through the quarter. And then with the bundled approach, there is a little wiggle room in which students can decide what type of assignment they are most excited about and do a little bit more work in that assignment category. So usually what it means is they always have to complete a couple of each assignment types. And then there's a kind of floating component of their grade where they can select whether they want to do an additional reading response or 2, an additional creative assignment or 2. And so they can weight their grade a little bit more towards the assignment type that builds on the skills they have, that engages with questions or materials they're most excited about, while still ensuring that they participate in each type of assignment through the quarter. So they're not opting out of any type of work, but essentially they're given the flexibility to focus a little bit of their time and some of their grade on the type of assignment they're most excited to do. Assignments are still graded in a really traditional approach. As I say, I don't practice ungrading or specifications grading. So they're still graded out of, say 10 points in each category, but what they have is the opportunity to take maybe 10 to 15% of their grade and focus it on one type of assignment or the other. So each assignment is still graded in a traditional way, and their grade is constructed out of these assignment grades, but there's a little bit of flexibility in terms of what any given student is going to be doing through the quarter, what they're going to spend more time doing. My hope is, and I think sort of anecdotally what I'm finding with students is that they both appreciate the flexibility. So again, there's always more assignments through the quarter than they're expected to complete, which means they can pick the topics that they're most interested in working on. It also means they're able to have a little bit more control over their schedule so they can align the work they're doing with my class along with the work they might be assigned in other classes, along with maybe their work schedules or their home care schedules, whatever it might be. So it gives them a little flexibility of when to do work through the quarter, what types of work they want to be doing. And I think both of those are aspects of classes that students seem quite happy about. I would say I think it also requires a little bit more work on their behalf in order to organize their times, organize their schedules, think through the work they're going to be doing. So for example, one thing I've introduced as I've used this approach is I now have them do a Canvas quiz where they just have to select whatever bundle they're going to be doing. I've created, and as part of the portfolio, have included checklists. So it lists all the assignments that are available to them, and then at the bottom it lists what the bundle requires of them, and so they're keeping track as they go of what they're doing. The other reason I incorporate a lot of choice is because I allow students to complete more assignments within a category than they actually need for their grade. So if there's 6 assigned, you need 3 or 4 for your bundle, depending on your bundle. If they complete 5, I'll just take their 4 best marks. So instead of having them resubmit, because these are quite short, focused assignments, I give them the opportunity to do additional assignments if they so choose, and then take their best grades. And tracking over time the grade distributions has really led to an interesting distribution pattern. There's now kind of double spikes where you have, say, a lot of students who are sitting at the C plus to B plus range will take an additional assignment, and then that'll push them up, usually 1 letter grade, so 2.5% kind of thing. And so tracking what their grades would have been had I taken the first assignments they did relative to where their grade ended up when they opted to do additional assignment is really gratifying, because then you can see that they put in additional work and that labor was rewarded with that bump to their grade. And so I really like having the opportunity for students to take that kind of initiative and be able to improve their grade in the class. It does, though, admittedly, obviously add grading labor. And so I'm very conscious that this is a recommendation I make warily, because it does add additional time. But to me, I would find at least sort of 5 to 10%, if not more, of students will opt to do that in any given class. And being able to see that that directly impacts their grades is, I think, a really gratifying thing. And so, I always sort of say that at the start of the quarter, that instead of extra credit, you have built into your course the ability to do this, to take on this extra work if you want. And I think it opens that door at the very beginning for students to take that ownership of their own performance in the class.
Do they have to commit to that then with that Canvas grade, like by a quiz by a certain date?
Well, so I asked them to do it at the very start, and they're responsible for doing that, but they have the option of changing at any given point in time. And so as they go, and this I think does happen where students, for example, maybe do really well on one assignment type and decide, okay, this is where I want to spend that a little additional window of my grade, my time. And it also saved me a lot of time, because then when I have this quiz that they have done, I have their responses of what bundle they're intending to do. So when it comes to calculating grades at the end of the quarter, it's pretty easy for me to then slot them into the Excel sheet that I've built for that specific bundle type, versus going through and seeing, okay, what did you actually complete? What bundle do I think you were meaning to do? Sure. I think this is always something important for any educator working in a department, that you want to make sure that what you're doing aligns with your department goals. And so as part of that, and I think this is something I did as part of my 10-year review package, was going through and calculating, for example, how grade distributions were impacted by the introduction of this selection and choice. So being able to provide clear data about student performance improvements through this, I think, was really effective. I would also say, I think, because I'm not necessarily adopting specifications grading or ungrading approaches, which maybe are a little more controversial about how they're working and how they're being employed in different spaces, I think the fact that my assignment types are still relatively mainstream and my approach to grading is still relatively mainstream, that probably aided a little bit in explaining what I was doing. Is also a very important question. I would say, yes, it required some front end work, probably less so than some types of sort of methods that you might want to introduce into your class. They were already assignments that I was doing. So assignment types I was doing, I was pulling on assignments I had already made. And I already had a lot of choice built in to classes. So following some, universal design approaches, there was already flexibility built into the model. So really, I think the only difference was deciding to allow some student or include some student agency and choice over what they were going to be doing through the course. I think what I did upfront was really build in those things like checklists and try and figure out how to structure that to make sure that assignment types were evenly distributed through the quarter, both for my own grading, but also for students as they were building the bundle that they wanted to complete. I think the one change I made was including that quiz, both to make sure they were clearly flagged early on and engaged with what the bundling system meant, but also then to give myself the information to not have to guess what they were trying to do. So I would say this specific approach did not require as much upfront as maybe some approaches to whether it's alternative grading or other agency-based methods in your class. I think really where the labor has fallen is in the additional work required for students who are going to complete more assignments than they need to for their bundle in order to improve their grades. I'm very happy to be in support of that, but I appreciate that that does add labor to the grading process. And I will say, maybe one challenge it's raised is students are not as easily able to keep on track of what their grades are without sort of doing the math themselves. And so I do field more questions through the quarter about how they are doing and what their status of their grade is. And I think that's more a function of the choice aspect than anything.